Terrific. So, in this section, we're going to add some functionality to our user input. If a user starts to type something, we want to react to the user typing, right? So, I'm going to define a new method at the top of the class. And I'm going to call this onInputChange, like so. So now I want to make sure that this method right here gets called anytime someone changes the text inside of our input. So in order to make sure of that, I'm going to create an event handler called onChange right here. And then I'll pass it a reference to the onInputChange method that we just created. And I'll say this dot onInputChange. And I want to highlight one point here. When we pass a method to a props like this called onInputChange, we do not put a set of parentheses at the end of it. If you were to put a set of parentheses on it, because I know what you're thinking, it means that onInputChange is going to be automatically called whenever a component is rendered. So we don't want to call onInputChange when our component is rendered. You follow? Instead, we want to call this function at some point in time in the future. So in other words, rather than calling this function with a set of parentheses, we're going to leave the parentheses and we're going to pass a reference to this function, to the input element, so that the input can call that function at some point in time. All right, so now what that means is anytime that someone types in something into the input, our callback is going to be invoked. And then this callback will be run with one argument being passed to it automatically, and we usually refer to that object as the event object. So this is pretty much normal JavaScript objects that will contain a bunch of information about the event that has just occurred. In this case, the user typed something. All right. Now, there's usually just one property inside of this entire object that we care about, and that is the event.target.value property. So this right here will contain the text that the user just added to our input. So let's try to console log that and see what we get. All right, so I'll save this and then flip back over. And as I add text, you'll see that in my console over here, whatever text I enter gets console logged out. If I delete the text inside my input, the console shows nothing. So pretty clearly, anytime that we type into the input and then the onInputChange method is going to be called automatically, and then we will be given whatever is typed into that input. So now, I'm sure a couple of quick questions have brewed up here, so let me see if I can address them. First off, you will indeed notice that we pass this callback function to a props on the input called onChange. It's a very special property name, and different events are going to be wired to different property names. In this case, we want to get a callback when we want to change this text input. So we use the property name onChange. There are several other property names for wiring up callbacks or event handlers, like onSubmit or onClick, of course. We might have probably seen those event handlers at some point in time. But the last thing that I want to mention about event handlers here is the name of the method that I put together that you see right here is indeed a community convention. So usually it's going to always be on, and then the name of the element that we are assigning to this callback, in this case an input, and finally the event that we are watching for, which is now the change event. So it's simply onInputChange. And anyone who reads this is going to understand when this function gets called, it gets called on input being changed. That makes sense, right? Cool. Now, let me tell you, too, that in some cases you may see a little variation on this, like handle input change, which means this is a function that is responsible for handling the input being changed. Personally, I like to use the on, and I think that it's slightly more popular, but to me it's more clear. But actually, the name of the callback does not really make too much of a difference. We can actually call this thing whatever we want, as long as we're going to change this one with the same name. I'm just telling you what the community conventions are so that, nobody calls you out. But this right here must be on change. If it's not, our function will not be called at any time. All right? So that is how to handle event handlers. So now we've got some value coming back from our user. Why don't we have a break right here and we will continue what to do with it in the next section. See you there.